Alright, so this is going to be just a quick retrospective. I'm just going to go over the graphs real quick and then briefly go over some of the things that the other nations involved could have done differently and that I could have done differently, both as far as pretender design goes and for actual gameplay. So the province count first shows that my expansion was really good and that my wars were generally stable, for lack of a better way of putting it. When I was fighting Marin Yan, you can see here that there was only a very brief dip from his counterattack, and then I was able to advance relatively steadily until he was completely eliminated. Similarly, when Pythian attacked, there was again a brief dip from him capturing some of my provinces. But as soon as I had the magic online that I wanted in order to fight him, I quickly caught up, and then you can also see the point where he broke here in that I just completely overwhelmed him. Similarly, at the end against both Gath and Archocephaly, I just had a giant spike because I was able to just run over them fairly quickly. You can also see the difference in Archocephaly's war in that Ulm was essentially lasting for a lot longer, both because he was larger from the get-go, and because he just played the early game a fair bit better. For forts, you can see that I was essentially building infrastructure constantly, or taking it from enemies, or even both. The constant fort building was because I was going for such a mage-oriented strategy, and I was able to spend most of my money on infrastructure and mages. For income, I had decent scales, but most of my income was essentially just commensurate with my size. The fact that I was able to take over the lake near the center of the map was also very helpful for letting me get just essentially extra gold that was relatively easy to defend. Gem income, I actually had a lot more gem income compared to my size than other nations, mostly because I was site searching very actively and with a relatively large variety of paths, because Chthonian alchemists just have a lot of paths to help site search with. My research was actually relatively slow in the beginning compared to other nations, because I was fighting Marin Yan with already a little bit of mage support. But it quickly grew past everyone else, both because I was constantly producing mages, and because of the fact that I was able to dump fire gems into lightless lanterns, which meant that even with my drain, I was able to outstrip all the other nations, including Archocephaly, which is normally an incredible nation at researching, and joven, who took either a dormant or an awake rainbow pretender, and focused heavily on his research. Dominion didn't really matter this game. The only person who had a Dominion effect that they cared about was Ulm's Immortal Vampires. It was essentially just a sign of size for the most part. For army size, I was actually doing fairly well in terms of my troop count, in spite of the fact that I didn't really produce very much cheap chaff. You can see that even though I was larger than Archocephaly for essentially the entire game, he devoted more of his resources to producing troops. Whereas I was focused mostly on mages and then individual super combatants for my own forces. Alright, and just to go over the other nations real quick, so Archocephaly is a very mage-oriented nation, and I don't think that the Archocephaly player really took the best advantage of his mystics. Typically, you'll see mystics deployed in somewhat complicated communions where you have to figure out the correct paths that you want on your slaves and masters. But once they are communioned up, they're incredibly strong. They can do a lot of very strong evocation, like acid spells, they can do gifts from heaven, and they can cast a large variety of buffs. The only thing that this Archocephaly did, which worked out pretty well, was getting flaming arrows up online early on. The other thing which he did, which was cool, was he had an unusual pretender with Cyclops with air paths. I don't think that his Cyclops was used to its fullest extent, but he did manage to come out on top of his early war, and he actually also was able to expand fairly well. If I were to have played Archocephaly, I probably would have taken an Awake N9 E4 Bless. That's something that Archocephaly can do because it has access to the Great White Bull. I also saw that used to great effect by Andre/NCMS, who was able to use it to get excellent expansion, and then the N9 Bless then helps Archocephaly's golems, which it has easy national access to. And yeah, you can essentially do the same thing with Archocephaly's golems as I did with mine, namely using them to drop on unprepared armies that won't be able to kill them. Without an N9 Bless, it's very, very difficult to do that, especially since Archocephaly doesn't have easy access to bone armor, even if they do have access to the death path. The other thing that the N9E4 Bless gives access to is very deep nature for globals. Mother Oak being the big one that comes online relatively early on, and then you can also just go for, or you can at least contest other nature globals later, since Archocephaly does have national nature blood searching. The other thing which Archocephaly did actually take advantage of this game is its elephants. So Archocephaly's elephants are the best in the game. They have long spears to help with repelling and incredible armor, which makes their expansion very clean even in LA, and also gives them a tool which can be very difficult for other nations to counter. So Pythian is a nation that's fairly difficult to use well. They have a variety of foreign recruit mages and a wide variety of path access from their fort mages as well. The downside, though, is that their mages are fairly unreliable. Your foreign recruit mages often will have randoms that you want to get access to that you won't always get, so your F mages won't always be F2, your blood mages won't always have blood, your fort mages are only going to have 2 in their path, or their path in an astral cross path around half of the time. So like when you're recruiting your death mages, you often want the D2 or the DS guys, and you'll just as likely not get them. So what that means is that you're essentially stuck with a lot of mages that are fairly inefficient. So you need to basically spam out the mages and then keep the guys that you don't want to use on lab duty while deploying the ones that you can actually use well. Some mod buffs Pythian by giving them access to things with different cults. So if they endorse the Sun cult, they get recruitable sacred warriors, they can summon sacred bulls, and they can transform Leos into thugs. The Serpent cult enables them to summon their, or to recruit their Hydras outside of their capital, which is cool. And then they can also recruit assassins everywhere, and they have a spell which lets their priests transform into serpents, which are fairly resilient and can even be used for thugging because they're sacred. The last cult, the Cult of Fertility, has kind of just weird magic. It's mostly just like utility-based stuff that like has a remote assassination spell, which is a little bit unreliable. And then they can also research more easily with their mages that usually have a research malice. So that's sort of basically the 3 things are: the Serpent Cult is the one if you just really, really want to use your Hydras a lot, as Pythian did this game with his Tribless. The Sun Cult is probably the most generally good one, in that you have relatively efficient Sacred Warriors, so you have some actually elite troops to stand in front of your mages, and gives you a little bit better thug access. And then the Cult of Fertility is essentially the cult where if you want to really play vanilla Pythian just better, just with more research to get access to all of the weird magic that Pythian can do. Because Pythian eventually can do Heat from Hell and Grip of Winter and Skeleton Spam and Rigor Mortis and all that good stuff. It's just that you don't have very reliable access to any of it. So Pythian in this game with his Tribless actually did okay. He was the other large player before the 2 of us went to war. The thing which he didn't do well, though, is leverage its early game strength to win an early war. So he needed to really invade someone right away. He could have attacked me, which would have been tricky for him, since even size 3 elementals would do fairly well. And my own double bless infantry can line hold quite a bit better than most. He could have invaded Joven and probably conquered him, which is probably what I would have done, and then he would have been larger and better equipped to face me. The other thing which he could have done is attack Marin Yan while I was attacking them, and try to take their capital for his own. So basically, the fact that he was trying to sit back and research up when he had crippled his scales and thus had very poor research led to his falling behind. And then the fact that his scales were so badly tanked meant that it was harder for him to pivot and then field the correct magic to counter my SCs. So Man is a nation that has essentially only one recruitable mage, the Magister Arcane, and then some unreliable mages, namely the Magisters and Judges. So Magisters and Judges can occasionally get you magic, so regular Magisters are fairly useful for their research if you just want, like, a lab rat that can't cast spells, but mostly you just want to get Magister's Arcane. So you saw the Thunderstrike Communion that Man set up, and that's one of the cool tricks which they can do, similar to Bogarus. But Magister's Arcane can also do a lot of cool Earth stuff. So in addition to Rain of Stones, they can communion up in the early game to cast Earth Meld, which usually is hard to spam on account of its high fatigue cost. It's something that Man can actually cast with just Thumb 1 and Alt 2, and then, if he had used that against TC's Cavalry, he might have been able to do a little bit better. Man also has fairly efficient crossbows, and they also have unusually heavy infantry crossbows, so guys who have shields and decent armor and then can also shoot back. So their early game strength is basically reliant on their decent infantry and then probably Earth Meld communions. The other thing which Man might have wanted to do is try going for Conjuration to get some elementals out. Man typically does want an Awake Expander, not because their own expansion is bad, but because they need to get to a larger size than most in order to actually snowball with their mages. Man has fairly poor late game since they have no National Blood access, and their SC access is essentially golems. So if they don't take an N9 Blessed, and similar to Arco, they don't have great, or their golems aren't like super awesome. Man does have National Nature income in spite of not having National Nature mages. So similar to Arco, I'd probably also want to look into getting an N9 Awake Expander, and they have access to the Thrice-Horned Bull, or the Thrice-Horned Boar, which is actually pretty good at it. If you don't want to take an N9 Bless, you can also just take a regular Expander, and that's fine. They tend to do okay. Man's Ghost King Expander was interesting in that it provided a fair bit of diversity, or it would have provided a fair bit of diversity in the late game. The problem, though, is that the Ghost King just isn't as good at expanding as monsters are, which might have been partially responsible for why Man was a little bit smaller, and eventually fell behind and was conquered. Ulm is a nation that also can have issues with expansion. Ulm's pretender for this game was the Vampire Queen, which is a popular pretender, both because it's just kind of a cool chassis, and also because it has the paths that are needed to summon vampire counts, which is one of Ulm's cooler national traits. This spell requires no research, and just requires blood and the paths to summon them. However, I think that a better expander for LA Ulm is the Man-Eater with Death added. That helps make up for their poor expansion by giving them a monster to expand with, and gives them something which can summon the vampire counts. Ulm actually played fairly well with the tools that he had, but because he was just significantly smaller than Arcocephaly, he got overwhelmed, and I think an Awake Expander would have helped out with that a fair bit. The other thing which Ulm didn't do is use the stealth capacity of his rangers to raid into Arcocephaly's territory, but on the other hand, he was very hard-pressed, so it's hard to say if that would have worked out better. Marin Yan, as I commented on during the game when I was fighting him, he took a very greedy build. The N9 Imprisoned build gave him great scales, of course, but it also meant that his expansion was just awful. And then the N9 Blessed didn't help him out a whole lot, just because Marin Yan's recruitable Sacreds are just really bad. They're just so bad you don't want to use those at all. Even if you're taking an N9 Blessed, just recruit more crossbows or something. Marin Yan is a nation that basically begs for an Awake Expander, although in this particular game, I might have taken a Hun Balam instead. That's a Blood Fire Jaguar. It's unreliable as an expander on its own, thanks to the fact that it just it's fairly weak in terms of its defenses. So it can die very easily to crossbows and heavy cavalry or barbarians or similar, and crossbows and heavy cav are much more common in LA. So something that you often want to do with that thing is use it either to take just the easier provinces or bring it alongside your troops so that the jaguars that it summons can basically help frontline, and then the Hun Balam himself can go in with some additional guys to prevent himself from being surrounded and easily taken down. So basically, Hun Balam plus an Arrow Lord and some crossbows can do a lot better than a Hun Balam on its own, and take on even some of the more difficult provinces. That also then would let him make soul contracts. So because of the research settings in the game, soul contracts would have been one of the better strategies for Marin Yan to focus on. That would have given him access to a fair number of devils, but even early on, and then as the game went on, he'd just be able to continue producing more and more of them. Because he has efficient blood mages and national fire income, he can actually really spam out the soul contracts and get a huge horde of devils. And yeah, that would have, given the research settings, the fact that you need only construction 2 in order to produce soul contracts, if you have a pretender who can make them, then you can actually start getting out devil hordes before anyone else can, and potentially even before people can field efficient counters to them. With the build that he had, though, he did okay. It's hard to say because when you're really far behind, it's hard to see what strategies you could have been using more effectively. If he split up his armies and tried to attack more territories, as he did towards the end of our war, he might have been able to cause a bit more damage, but he was essentially fighting from just a massive disadvantage on account of his small size. Tntree is a nation with foreign recruit units that essentially just relies on spamming out their foreign recruit heavy cavalry. Someone buffs them a little bit by making them cheaper, and the map settings buff them a lot on account of the fact that they're essentially just resource gated in terms of how many of the heavy cavalry they can churn out. They also have pretty cool out-of-cat mages. They're larger than usual for LA, and can often cast strong magic like Rain of Stones, Earth Buffs, and Skella Spam. So they're, yet again, a nation that can do well with an Awake Expander, not because their expansion is bad, but because they can snowball their expansion with their foreign recruitment. I think Tntree did okay this game, in that he was rushing Man, and he did fairly well in that early war. The player just kind of went AI as soon as he had the setback of being invaded by Gath. So, yeah, shame on him for that. But, yeah, his huge blob of heavy cavalry did fairly well in pinning Man down in his capital. I think that he potentially could have invested a bit more in infrastructure in order to get more mages out. But it's hard to say because, again, he just kind of went AI when he was... when he hit a speed bump. I also don't think that he took an Awake Expander, but I don't really know. I didn't watch him very closely this game. If he did take an Awake Expander, though, then he was a little bit undersized. In spite of the fact that he was at an okay size, he wasn't as big as you would expect from having that huge advantage. So Joven. Joven's a nation that has a lot of cool national magic, but the most efficient way to play is often just to ignore that. So Joven in this game took a Rainbow Pretender, which I really dislike, because Rainbow Pretenders have very backloaded power, and Joven itself needs to have a fairly strong early game in order to even do okay. They don't have any national blood. Their special national magic, the only really well scaling ones are the Dione, and they don't have national death magic to get access to that. Additionally, Joven's larger mages come from only underwater forts, and they don't have national recruitable amphibians in order to go take them. So, Joven also has expansion issues just based on the fact that their guys don't have shields. So while they can expand fairly well into tribes and barbarians, and they can even they even don't have any particular weaknesses against heavy cavalry, they are really awful against crossbows. The Samurai cavalry are a bit cheaper now, and that does help them a lot because the Samurai cavalry are kind of what they would want to use to expand with in general. But yet again, taking an Awake Expander is something which just helps them out immensely, both to getting to a decent size, and if they take an Earth Snake, getting them underwater. So once they do have an underwater fort, then they can start using their Ryujin. They just need construction 2 in order to send someone underwater with the to the fort in order to then build a lab and a temple, or in order to build a temple there to get the Ryujin. Joven's early game relies on indie crossbows, so it's often helpful to be able to rush for those provinces, which again an Earth Snake can help with. And then they kind of often want to ignore their national magic for a little bit and focus on stuff like elementals, which the Shugenja can do fairly well given their wide variety of elemental paths. So yeah, the best advice for playing Joven is often to just ignore their national stuff to do the just generic elemental and crossbow stuff. Eventually they can switch over to recruiting their astral mages. Because they're slow to recruit, though, you often can't afford the fort turns to recruit them early on, since you'll just fall behind on research, and you need to be ahead on research in order to even keep parity, given your lack of blood access and awesome national units. Agartha was me, and I think I did fairly well. The thing I would have changed about my Pretender design would have been to reduce my Earth Bless. I really just didn't need the extra protection from E9, and the reduced Bless would have given me a lot more design points to either help out my research, or let me spam out even more units. Gath, this game took an enormous Bless, Gath can actually be played a variety of ways because they have Recruit Anywhere Sacreds, they have Out of Capital Blood access, they can Blood Sacrifice, which helps push Dominion if they ever get into a stalemate, and they have Summonable Thugs. If they take an N Bless, potentially with something else, then they even have decent recruitable Thugs. I don't think that Gath played particularly well. Even like if the build that he had was okay, he didn't really leverage his mages very well. He had lots of Yediona, which are actually very useful mages. They can scale spam or cast earth buffs. But he, just didn't deploy them with his armies. He summoned a bunch of scorpions, which just didn't really seem to do very much. So what I would have done differently, if I had taken his Bless, I would have probably played more aggressively than he did. Try to use the Levites and Gibberim to push for an early war with their double Bless against either Tntree, who he eventually conquered, or even against Joven, who he invaded from the south, or both. The other thing which Gath does well is blood stuff. So with their national bloods, they can summon Serim, which are these really awesome 3-attack sacred demons, and they can use the Bless actually much better than even any of Gath's recruitables, but you do need to have a decent blood economy in order to do that. So you would need to recruit a fair number of your Kohanim, and then have the Kohanim out blood hunting. The other thing which Gath has is fairly efficient S-mages. So if you take better scales, then you can use those as your lab rats. Gath's build kind of sacked his magic, which meant that his research was just not that great. If I were to play Gath, I would probably not take a Tri-Bless as he did. I would instead focus on just one Bless, probably just Nature, and then either get much better scales or get an Awake Expander. One of the two, depending on how I was feeling in terms of what I want to focus on. Giant Bless Gath can do well. I saw someone take an Awake Tri-Bless and actually just roll some people early on. But in general, you're not going to want to do that. That's kind of a gimmicky strat. And even in a game like this, it's doubtful that that would have worked well. And while they do have out-of-cap Sacreds, the fact that their temples are very expensive and the out-of-cap Sacreds are just mediocre human infantry means that if you're focusing on a Giant Bless strategy, you need to also be at a decent size in order to even be able to afford your infrastructure. And the fact that Gas Mages are actually decent and that their blood is awesome means that I prefer focusing on a build that can actually take advantage of these other awesome national attributes. So that was that's just the quick overview of the nations that were in this game and what they could have potentially done differently. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed watching.